towards taking this course. Why is dynamics and control of mechanical systems important and relevant in today's world? So the instructors for this course, as this slide indicates, are Professor Ghoshal and myself. So Professor Ghoshal has been teaching this course for several years now, and I have joined him over the last couple of years. So last year, I taught the dynamics half of this course, and the year before that, the controls half. And this year, we discussed that I will handle both dynamics and controls together. So I shall start off this course by asking this question as to why it is worthwhile to study dynamics and controls. So I don't know the different backgrounds that each of you are from, but this course concerns design, dynamics and control of mechanical systems. So if one were to ask, what is it that sets a mechanical engineer apart from other engineering disciplines? What's the one thing that would come to mind when one talks of a mechanical engineer? So when one talks of a civil engineer, we think of bridges and buildings. When one talks of a computer engineer, we think of software and hardware and so on. So similarly, when one talks of a mechanical engineer, what's that first image that would come to mind? To my mind, at least, the first image would be of a machine. So mechanical engineers build machines that do useful mechanical work, right? So if you probe this further and ask what are the major components of a machine, again there are three major components that come to my mind. The first is a source of energy. We shall call that a motor. It could be it could be a heat engine like an IC engine, or it could be an electrical motor, or it could be a chemical motor, you name it. So there is a source of energy, and then there is a mechanism or a set of mechanisms which modify motion and forces. So you want something to move along a certain direction or apply a certain force or along a certain trajectory in a certain waveform. All these modifications are done by means of these very clever contraptions called as mechanisms. And the third element to this is control. So you would want to have a handle over what this machine does and not run away doing whatever it wants. So it could either be manual or it could be automatic. You want to shut it off. It could be as simple as shutting it off and turning it on, but it could be more sophisticated also. So there are these three elements that comprise a machine, and as you can see, dynamics and controls, already you can see controls represented in one element, but dynamics is also prominently represented in the design and development of a machine. And what I shall do in the next slide is take one example of a machine and show how a lot of different subjects that we study in our undergrad come into play in design and development of a machine such as the one that I have shown here. So as an inspiration for this discussion, I have borrowed this line from a famous poem by William Blake, to see the world in a grain of sand. So the sand here is a metaphor for a machine. So practically any machine that you take has invariably most of the elements of mechanical engineering coming into play in their design and development. So the world here are the different subjects that we study in mechanical engineering, and each grain of sand is metaphorically supposed to represent a particular machine. And what is it that takes? What does it take to build a machine such as this particular one, the backhoe loader? So I've picked this because this is one of the most striking machines that we can come across in our daily life. You don't have to go to a shop floor or some industry or some mining site to see this. You can see them on the roadside digging stuff up and moving earth and so on. And it's very hard to lift your gaze off of this. There are so many joints and so many links, and you sometimes envy that operator who has this very clever toy to play with, right? You can move earth from here to there and so on and so forth. So it's a very exciting object to look at. So I have taken this as the example of the machine that I would wish to discuss and show how every branch of mechanical engineering goes into its development. So to start with, somewhere inside, you have the engine, which is an IC engine, a diesel engine perhaps, and also a hydraulic pump, probably, because you see this hydraulic pistons and cylinders which are used to actuate all these these links. So what does it take to develop these engines and the hydraulic pump? Of course, you would need to know thermodynamics, heat transfer, fluid mechanics, probably. Then there is, of course, the manufacturing of this and the design and manufacturing of this machine, and that requires you to know statics and strength of materials, because you need to be sure that when this machine is moving earth or moving boulders and digging up stuff, the kind of stresses that are generated don't break these links. And then there is, of course, material science, which guides what material to choose for what part. And then there is manufacturing, of course. And then the third pillar that helps us to design this, develop this machine is excavator operation, which involves kinematics. So you see a lot of mechanisms here, a lot of 4-bar mechanisms and so on. And then there is dynamics, the way the motion of all these excavators and so on are related to the kind of pressures or forces that I would need to apply. And then there is, of course, control. In this case, it is manual control, but one can easily imagine that it can also be automated. So you see, therefore, that practically every single branch of mechanical engineering goes into the development of a machine such as this one, but this also applies to any other machine that you could possibly think of. Now, over the last couple of years, I've interacted with a few of the MTech students from mechanical engineering, and I have heard that dynamics and controls and kinematics even are treated in a stepmotherly fashion, or treated as a stepchild during their undergraduate education. So it is not emphasized much, and people, if they can, try to set it aside and so on. So what I would like to do first is to tell you how your understanding and knowledge of dynamics and control can make you uniquely employable. So let us once again look at this slide and see who your competitors are, who can take away jobs from you based on their expertise. So for example, a civil engineer might also learn fluid mechanics. So perhaps a civil engineer can take away jobs involved in design of hydraulic pumps from you. Then there is also statics and strength of materials, which will be the bread and butter of a civil engineer. They have to know this to construct bridges and buildings. So there too, you are facing competition from your colleagues, across the road in IISc. And then there is material science, which is where you're going to face competition from material engineering students. And then manufacturing, and here you're going to face competition from people who study production engineering. And in the top square, electrical engineers also learn controls. So they could also be potentially hired by an employer who wants to make a backhoe loader. But then that leaves us with 4 topics which are not covered by any of our sister engineering disciplines. So you see on the top that you have kinematics and dynamics, which are hardcore mechanical engineering topics. And then at the bottom, you have thermodynamics and heat transfer. Again, something that is heavily emphasized by mechanical engineering curriculum, and you get a good grounding in it in your undergrad education. So of these 2, which can place you at a unique, which can provide you with unique advantages in terms of your employability, it is a little saddening for some of us to see that there is tremendous emphasis placed on the second 2 topics, thermodynamics and heat transfer, but not so much on dynamics and controls. So it is hoped that through your exposure to courses such as this one, this imbalance would be corrected ever so slightly, and you would come to recognize that kinematics and dynamics and knowledge of these topics can really be of use to you from the point of view of your employment, from the point of view of putting food on the table. So what kinds of companies would hire a graduate who has expertise in these topics, kinematics, dynamics, and controls? What kinds of industries would hire them? Well, you could, at the most general level, argue that as long as you have requirements for moving stuff for people from point A to point B, you would have requirements. As long as you have moving parts in a machine, you would have requirements for kinematics and dynamics and controls. So it practically encompasses so many industries that it's not something that I need to even pick up and talk about or give an exhaustive list of. But what I have done in the next slide is to highlight a few industries which also have potential for growing in future, which would particularly require expertise in these topics: kinematics, dynamics, and controls. So as far as usefulness is concerned, the first example that I have taken is
Excuse me, sir.
yes.
Could you put it in full slide mode?
Pardon me.
This is an executive mode. So we are seeing the next slide also on the side.
I don't know how to.
In the display settings
Let
on
me
the
just
top.
try.
Yeah.
Let me just try again. Can I? How do I get out of this? Though I don't know.
On the top there is display settings.
On the top there is display settings. Okay, yes,
In that,
I see that.
yeah, you can just not be use
Swap presenter view and slide.
presenter view.
Is that what I need to pick?
No.
This is okay, right?
This, so now also we see both. This
No,
is okay.
now you are seeing everything. You're only
yes.
seeing whatever I wish to show you, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll continue. So in terms of usefulness, the first area, the industry that I've picked is robotics. Already robots are widely used in industries to do things that are either too boring for human beings to do or too dangerous for them to do. So on the left, you see a GIF file of robotic spot welding happening on an automotive shop floor. And then robots are also used to undertake tasks increasingly, which require a lot of fineness and precision. So robotic surgery is what you see on the right. This is still a growing field, but it will grow much bigger. So human hands have jitter, they can shake about and so on. So you need not, it's possible that you are not as precise in holding your forceps and tweezers during surgery as one might desire. So medical robots, however, solve that problem. So you can very precisely position the end effectors and get them to undertake very fine operations. So a less glamorous application of dynamics and controls is in stabilization of ships. In this figure image on the right, I have shown two boats. The one on the left has a certain stabilizing device called as a gyroscope installed in it. The one on the right, however, doesn't. And you can see the kind of difference that there is in the motion, and you can imagine the kind of comfort levels that you would have for a person sitting inside one vis-a-vis someone sitting inside the other. So this ability to stabilize, these are called anti-roll gyros. So they prevent the boat from rocking about its longitudinal axis on account of the pressure variations it feels on the left side vis-a-vis the right side due to the waves that it is riding underneath. So this very cool device is something that we will look at also in this course and see how we can design and design anti-roll gyros. These are used also in huge ships, in luxury cruises and so on, so that by definition, a luxury cruise is supposed to be a pleasurable experience for its passengers, right? So they don't want this kind of rolling motion to give them seasickness. So anti-roll gyros are installed in such ships in order to be sure that the platform on which people put their foot and sit are all stable and flat. They don't rock about back and forth. So these are a couple of examples I have taken from the present world, the world as it exists now. As I said, if I have to cover where all dynamics is employed, it just involves anything that moves. So I have not taken other examples. But going forward, the 21st century is likely to be the century of autonomous vehicles. So just as the 20th century was a century of automobiles, cars, and so on, at the turn of the 20th century, for example, horses were replaced by cars. Okay, horse-driven carriages were replaced by cars. So such carriages were not called cars to start with; they were instead called horseless carriages. Okay, so now already we start there is this talk of driverless cars, right? So driverless cars are in some sense analogous to horseless carriages. And over a period of time, I'm sure we'll coin a new name. Just as we got rid of horseless carriages and called them cars, we shall get rid of driverless cars and call them something else, maybe a robotic taxi or whatever. And that's going to be the predominant mode of transport. Why is it so promising? It's because statistics have shown that cars are stationary 98% of the time, believe it or not. So you just drive your car from point A to point B to get to wherever you're working, but then it just sits there till the evening, and then you drive it back, and it sits there back in your garage for the remainder of the night, all the way till next morning. So 98% of the time, a car is not in use. Okay, so it can be put to better use if you don't, have private cars, but instead taxis like Uber and so on, and you are able to use them on demand. So that's the future of transportation. And since each individual does not need to own cars and they can instead share these cars, the number of cars on the road is expected to come down by nearly 70%. So in order to design and develop these autonomous vehicles, you need to know dynamics and controls. And then we'll talk more about it sometime later. And then there are drones. So you already have these quadcopters and so on, which are used for a variety of applications in agriculture, in surveillance, and even Amazon also, I think, intended to deliver their products to the doorstep using such quadcopters. And then you have seen their use as weapons. In United States war against Afghanistan. So a lot of the caves were bombed by these unmanned aerial vehicles, and that could be flown at a reduced cost, both to human life as well as financially, compared to regular aircraft. So autonomous vehicles are going to define the way transportation happens in the 21st century. And by knowing dynamics and controls, you would be ideally poised to be a participant in the development of such autonomous vehicles. And going further still into the 21st century, there is this whole idea of space exploration. People are already talking, commercial interests such as Elon Musk and his SpaceX corporation. They're already talking of colonization of Mars. And if you want to colonize, other planets, you need to know how to design and develop rockets. You need to know how to design and develop spacecraft to take you, from outside of Earth to another planet. And then you need to know how to design and develop rovers to explore those planets. So every single one of these requires knowledge of dynamics and controls. So as you can see, there are all these different, industries. Some of them a little futuristic, some of them very current and relevant. That would want a person who has expertise and knowledge in dynamics and controls, and therefore you would be ideally poised to participate in all these exciting developments that are already there or are coming up in the 21st century. Apart from these perspectives, apart from the usefulness angle, which is important for a person seeking a job, many of you are research students. You have come to do PhDs and so on because you have an academic bent of mind. So there is something, there's a curiosity angle that picks your imagination. You don't want to just know that something works. You are also interested in to know why it works, how to analyze its working, and so on and so forth. So in addition to the usefulness angle as motivation for knowing dynamics and controls, there's also the curiosity angle. And here I wish to give a couple of examples. So the first is a frisbee. So you have played with the frisbee when you were a child, or perhaps you continue to play with it now. A frisbee is nothing but a flying disc. Now it turns out that when you release a frisbee, I'm sure all of you have noticed it when you have played with the frisbee, it wobbles a little bit, and it also spins about its axis. So this wobbling is this slight up and down motion that the frisbee undertakes as it travels travels from point A to point B. And then it's also, of course, the way it is released from the side, you also end up imparting a certain spin to it. Did you know that to within maybe 1% or better, the frequency of spin is exactly half the frequency of wobble. So no matter how you release it, you cannot independently determine this wobbling frequency and the spinning frequency. They are intimately connected. In fact, this equation that relates the two is something that we will discuss in this course. And this is a very neat fact. So regardless of how big the frisbee is and how you have released it, the wobbling frequency is exactly twice, almost exactly, within a few percent, exactly twice the spin frequency, no matter what. So this is a cool fact, and I was actually hooked when I learned it. And it turns out that I was not the only one who was hooked. Someone far more eminent and capable than me. You must have heard of this physicist by name Richard Feynman. He is considered the father of nanotechnology. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on quantum electrodynamics and so on. It turns out that it was this very problem, I don't know the details though, but it was this very problem that he solved. And it was this very problem of understanding the wobbling and spinning of a disk that led him to developments in quantum mechanics, which eventually fetched him the Nobel Prize. So he himself has confessed that solving this problem of a plate, which is wobbling about as it spins, was what ultimately inspired him to get ideas that led him to his Nobel Prize. So that's a huge thing to say, for a problem that looks as modest as this one. The second example, once again from the curiosity angle, is of a top. I'm sure most of you have played with a top when you were a child. So what you end up doing while you play with a top is that you spin it and you release it on the ground. And this top spins about for quite some time and keeps your eyes riveted on it, keeps you engaged for that entire duration. Now, there is this interesting thing that happens with a spinning top. Let us say this top that you see here is not spinning. Okay, it is not spinning about its axis of symmetry. I were to release it at an angle that is tilted to the vertical. What do you expect would happen? You would expect that this top would simply, fall down due to gravity, right? But suppose I set it spinning in the manner that has been shown in these schematics and then release it. And I release it at an angle to the vertical. Believe it or not, it will not fall down. Instead, what it will do is it will undertake a rotational motion about the vertical. And this kind of motion is called precession. So the fact that it doesn't fall down is itself a very interesting counterintuitive realization. What is even more interesting about this is, regardless of the angle at which I release it. So in the two schematics on the right, you see two tops, one which is tilted at a certain angle to the vertical, the other whose axis is tilted at a much greater angle to the vertical. It turns out that at both these angles of release, the precession frequency is going to be the same. So whether I release it at a certain small angle to the vertical or at a large angle to the vertical, the precession frequency is independent of that angle of release. So that's again a very counterintuitive and interesting notion in connection with tops. It turns out that a study of rotation of tops is a major branch in dynamics, and it has engaged some fairly famous mathematicians in history. So this is sufficient motivation as far as dynamics is concerned. What about controls? How do we motivate you guys towards learning controls? So if you take any of these topics that I discussed here, for example, let us take autonomous vehicles. You have designed a car which you want to drive on an Indian road. It's a robotic car. It doesn't require you to sit behind the steering wheels. What challenges will we face? The first problem that we will face is that we are not really sure what all forces act on these cars. We are not sure about the kind of friction that there would be between the road and the tire, especially on Indian roads, which can change in complexion from point A to point B. You could have potholes and exposed gravel at some points. You could have tarred asphalted roads on another. So there's so much uncertainty associated with the forces that act on the car. You don't know its inertia ahead of time. You don't know how many passengers you are carrying in this car. So there is some uncertainty associated with the dynamic model of the car. Okay, and as I said, there are environmental uncertainties, in terms of air drag, and more importantly, on Indian roads, you have jaywalkers, people crossing the streets from all sides. So these can be treated as disturbances in some sense. in the sense that I will talk about later on in the course. So you have all these uncertainties that affect the functioning of a robotic car. So you want it to travel from point A to point B with a certain velocity waveform. You want it to accelerate to 60 kilometers per hour and travel at that uniform speed and so on. You're going to end up in jail, right? So you're going to have people crossing the street at all sorts of random times, and you're going to have uncertainty. You cannot accelerate the same way with 4 passengers in your car vis-a-vis having just a single passenger. You cannot accelerate when you have a very muddy and uneven road as what you would do when you have a very smooth flat road, etc., etc. So the point I want to make with this example is that the real world is full of uncertainties. Even if you take robotics, if I want to pick an object and place it in a different location, I would have to contend with all sorts of modeling inaccuracies. There will be friction, and which I may not be able to account for properly. And I may not know enough about the part that I'm handling, so the inertia will have some uncertainty with it, etc., etc. So the role of controls, in particular feedback control, is to deal with these uncertainties. So the way we deal with uncertainties is intuitively obvious to us. So if you have a robotic car and you are driving on an Indian road, what would you do? You would, of course, use your eyes, right? You would use your eyes to see what is happening in front of you. If there's a person crossing the street at an unexpected location, you would apply the brakes. So therefore, you intuitively understand the centrality of sensors in dealing or contending with uncertainties in the world around us. When we don't know how to do something exactly as a consequence of our own ignorance of the machine that we are trying to control, or the environment in which the machine exists, then we better invest in a sensor that can detect speed, that can detect position, etc., etc., that can take images of the objects around you and appropriately control the motion of this machine to respond in the presence of these uncertainties. And the branch of knowledge, mathematics, I would say that, I wouldn't say mathematics, I'm sorry. The branch of engineering that studies, controlling a machine by using information from a sensor and modifying the input to that machine appropriately based on this sensory data is called feedback control. Okay, and the general block diagram for a single input, single output feedback system is shown here. So you measure something and you compare it with a reference, something you want this to behave in a certain way, and you see how well it is adhering to what you would like it to behave as. And any error between the desired motion and the actual motion is corrected for by means of a controller. And this provides a control effort which appropriately modifies the input to the plant and gets it to do your bidding. So the last place where you would apply feedback control is when you are working with unstable systems. So what we mean by unstable systems is something again that we will look later on from a dynamics perspective, is something we look at later in this course. But you can think of simple examples. An inverted pendulum is an unstable system, right? So if you have propped up a pendulum, there's an equilibrium point at the top. So, but any small disturbance is going to, kick this pendulum bob off of that equilibrium point. Now, why do you would wonder why, as an engineer, would I want to design an unstable system? Sometimes you have no choice. So a nuclear power plant is by its very nature unstable. At other times, it is deliberately engineered. So for example, you have aircraft that are deliberately engineered to be unstable because it increases the maneuverability of the aircraft. It's easier to steer an aircraft about in 3D if it is made slightly unstable vis-a-vis if it is completely stable. So there are engineering reasons why one would want to design unstable systems intentionally, or at other occasions contend with instability. And the only way to make these unstable systems useful to you is by means of feedback control. So this is the second part of the course. We would discuss feedback control of dynamic systems. And with that, the course would come to its end. So I hope I have given enough practical examples to motivate you to learn about both dynamics of mechanical systems as well as control of mechanical systems. So with that, I shall move to the contents of this course. The first 1 month would be devoted to rigid body dynamics in 3 dimensions. So in your undergrad education, we assume that you have seen rigid body kinematics and rigid body dynamics, but only in 2 dimensions. You may also have learned a little bit of rigid body dynamics in 3 dimensions. So this content, to some extent, acts as a bridge between stuff that you have already come across in your undergrad and stuff that we would be discussing in greater detail later on in this course. So here I would start off by talking about kinematic relationships and representation of orientation of a rigid body. So this is the first problem that we need to confront and address. How do we represent the orientation of a rigid body in relation to an inertial coordinate system, in relation to Earth, for instance? And in this context, we introduce what are known as rotation matrices. And to appropriately, to capture the essentials of a rotation matrix, which is an abstract mathematical entity, we use more, down to earth and easily understandable language, and that's the language of Euler angles. So we represent rotational matrices by means of Euler angles. So representation of orientation is the first and the most important thing in relation to understanding rigid body dynamics. So that's the first thing that we would learn, and that's followed by the laws of motion. So there's a familiar Newton's laws, which is F is equal to ma, which govern translational motion of a rigid body. And then there is the motion for rotations of rigid bodies, and that's called Euler's equation. And we shall first talk about the Newton-Euler formulation, and that leads us also to a relatively unfamiliar concept perhaps, and that's the concept of the inertia matrix. So most of you would have come across the notion of moment of inertia in your undergrad and in your pre-university education. And moment of inertia is, as introduced in the undergrad level, usually treated as a scalar quantity similar to mass. But it turns out that in 3 dimensions, this moment of inertia generalizes to the inertia matrix, which is a 3x3 matrix. So we will talk about how the inertia matrix connects angular velocity to angular momentum and so on and so forth. And that is followed by practical examples, applications of the equations of motion to understand rigid bodies. So we would first start by talking free symmetric tops. So the word tops is usually used by people in physics who write textbooks on dynamics. Essentially, they are talking of cylindrically symmetric objects which are spinning about their axis of symmetry. And when they say free, they mean that gravity does not apply any torque and affect the angular motion of these objects. So the frisbee, for example, is a free symmetric top. A satellite in space, for example, is a free symmetric top. You have gravity acting on them, but it doesn't affect their rotational motion. And then you have what are known as heavy symmetric tops, which are, for example, the top, for example, which I talked about earlier, spinning on the ground, is an example of a heavy top because its motion is affected by the torque applied by gravity. So the center of mass is offset from the center about which it is rotating, namely the pivot, and therefore it applies a torque, and that can affect the motion of such tops. And we'll talk about that next. Of course, as engineers, we might not like the word tops because it looks too childish and amateurish. We would probably prefer the word gyroscope. A gyroscope is essentially a top. It's basically a cylindrically symmetric object which is spinning about its axis of symmetry. So we will talk about gyroscopes, and gyroscopes have had a huge impact on 20th century technology. So we will see, as I showed you in one of my slides earlier, how a gyroscope can be used to stabilize a rocking ship. We will see how a gyroscope can be used as a compass, how it can be used for sensing the orientation of an aircraft or the angular velocity of an aircraft, and so on and so forth. So it has myriad applications, and we shall take a look at a few of them. With this, we shall then, in the second month, in November, we shall move on to multi-body dynamics, which is basically the dynamics of an interconnection of rigid bodies. And here again we would start with kinematics. So in the last time I taught this course, I introduced the kinematics necessary for say a single rigid body as well as for study of multiple rigid bodies in one shot. And my students complained that I confused them with all the notations. So this time I have adopted a slightly different distribution of material. I'll first talk about kinematics as it is relevant to a single rigid body in the first month, and then talk about other concepts that are useful, for example, homogeneous transformations and so on, and then talk about velocity propagation. So if you have an interconnection of rigid bodies as you would have in a serial or a parallel kinematic mechanism, how would the velocities of one joint be related to the velocities of another joint? This would be covered first, velocities and accelerations and positions and so on. And then we again come back to dynamics, and this time we use a new tool for writing down the equations of motion, and this tool is called the Lagrangian formalism. We introduce the notion of a Lagrangian, which is related to the kinetic and potential energies of the rigid bodies that comprise this multi-body system. And then from that, there's something called as the Euler-Lagrange equation, which we use to derive the equations of motion. Ultimately, the equations of motion will be no different from the Newton-Euler formulation, but it has several distinct advantages. So, for example, many of the internal forces that one has to consider while writing down the equations of motion with the Newton-Euler formulation will not be necessary. So, the development of the equations of motion will be greatly simplified by using the Lagrangian formalism, and therefore it's ideally suited for discussing multi-body systems. And we will take examples of robotic manipulators and other mechanisms for applying the Lagrangian formalism and obtaining the equations of motion. So once you have the equations of motion, you need to solve for these equations of motion. And what you would discover when you finally derive these equations is that they are in general nonlinear ordinary differential equations, and therefore it's not possible in general to solve them by hand. So therefore the last part of this module would talk about numerical techniques to solve the equations of motion. So at this point we will have the midterm, and then we will then proceed to feedback control. So feedback control again has two modules. Traditionally, if you look at from a chronological perspective, if you look at the development of control systems, they were all developed in the frequency domain. So by frequency here, I mean you need to recollect how you can represent a signal in terms of, for example, a periodic signal in terms of sinusoids and so on, as you can do with by using the Fourier series. So an extension of that is Fourier transforms, which allows you to represent aperiodic signals in terms of frequencies, in set of a continuum of frequencies and things like that. So these notions were intimately linked with the development of telephony and so on in the early parts of the 20th century. So this was a tool that was used most widely by the pioneers in control theory. And so we will probably take this same chronological approach to introducing control systems here. These are very intuitive, easy to use tools, and they all depend on us knowing a few mathematical techniques, in particular Laplace transforms, maybe a little bit of Fourier transforms, and then this notion of transfer functions. Then we'll introduce these techniques for design and analysis of control systems in the frequency domain, using the transfer functions of these dynamic systems, and they include Nyquist plots, Bode plots, and root locus. And then we will discuss briefly about feedback systems. We won't have too much time. Design of feedback systems is a very big topic in itself. We will briefly introduce how one would go about undertaking the design in the frequency domain. And then we would come to time domain, representation of a dynamic system and design of a feedback controller in the time domain. And this is done by using this tool called state space based representation of a dynamic system. So you represent a dynamic system as by means of a first order differential equation, but a vector differential equation. and these are called the state equations. And then talk about the state transition matrix, which is again which arises in connection with the solution to the state equations for a linear system. And then we talk about how we can modify the dynamics of this system by using this technique called pole placement. And this technique, for it to be practical, imposes some demands on the mathematical structure of the equations that govern this dynamic system's behavior. And two concepts in connection with that are controllability and observability. So we will introduce these two concepts, and then we will talk about design of state observers in case some of the states cannot be observed experimentally, and then we will conclude this module as well. So this is as far as the course content is concerned. Maybe at this point I can take some questions if there are any, before I talk about the grading structure and so on for this course. Are there any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions from the students. So I shall now move on to the grading structure. So there will be about 10 homeworks, and the cumulative weightage for homeworks is 20%. So that amounts to about 2 points per homework. Each homework would be connected with the previous or upcoming class material fairly closely, and would often include problems that require MATLAB programming. So when you think of the weightage for the homeworks, it's just 2 points per homework, right? So you would probably think that these 2 points are not a big deal, but believe me, these 2 points are far more important than what you might intuitively imagine them to be, because these 2 points, if you are able to gain them, will set the stage for you earning the remaining points in the midterms and the examinations. So if you are not sincere in solving the problems that are given in the homework, these problems may not be very tough, but they help to refresh some of the concepts that would be taught in the previous lectures, and sometimes help build familiarity with the concepts that I would be introducing in the next few lectures. So doing the homeworks, therefore, prepares proper ground for you to closely follow the material that I would be teaching. And there will be 2 midterms. Each of them have 25% weightage, and then there will be one final examination, which is weighted 30%. Now, usually we have these arguments around the time of the first midterm as to when exactly to schedule it. So whenever I bring up this matter of fixing the date, students will complain about how it clashes with some other presentation, some other midterm, some other commitment that they would have on that particular date, and we can rarely ever come to a consensus on an appropriate date. So any date we pick would be an uncomfortable, inconvenient date for some student in the class. So therefore, I have decided this semester that I would fix the date ahead of time. So please make note of it right away. In this course, we shall have the first midterm on the 1st December 2020, no matter what. Okay, so if there is some clash that comes up, you cannot come to me and complain that there is a clash with some other course. You kindly go approach the other course instructor to change his or her exam date. Or if you are uncomfortable with working with a fixed date, kindly consider taking this course some other time, maybe next year or something, if there are clashes this year. So the first midterm is fixed, and it's going to be on 1st December. It's going to be during the class hours, and it's going to be a 1.5 hour midterm. Then the second midterm again is fixed. It's going to be on 14th January, just after completion of this controls material. We would have a midterm, and that's again in the interest of avoiding this endless debate of the exam date. I have chosen it to be on 14 January 2021. I'm sorry, not 2020. I'm sorry about the typo there. And the final exam is going to be as per the timetable issued by the institute. So whenever they say we should conduct it, we shall have it. And to assist me in teaching this course, we have 2 people. We have Yogesh Pratap Singh, who is Professor Goshal's student. He will be the formal teaching assistant. So he will be the one who will probably be helping with correction of homework and such other things. And then, given the fact that this course is administered online, we will have a technical assistant also, Rakesh Kumar, again a student from mechanical engineering, who is a master student here. He will help with some of the technical issues that you might have if you are not able to access certain homework or a certain lecture recording or whatever. And as far as the questions in connection with the technical material are concerned, you can email me. So I have given my email address here, jayant@iiac.ac.in. So please make note of all these 3 email IDs. They are fairly important. What we request you to do right away, as soon as this class is done, is you please send an email to Yogesh and give him your email address and tell him where exactly you are logging in from. Are you from a city? Are you from a village? That will help us understand the kind of constraints that you might be under, and that will help us plan this course appropriately. So the first request I wish to make is kindly contact Yogesh as soon as this class is done, and send him an email and give him your email address and tell him where you are logging in from. So that information would be useful to us. And if you have questions about the technical material we will discuss during the course, I don't wish to have specific office hours for this. Please send me an email, and I will we can discuss about a suitable time for taking these questions. And with that, I'm done with this presentation. So here are the references. There is this textbook by Merriam and Craig, which we will be using for the first part, and then a textbook written by Professor Ghoshal himself on robotics, which we will be using for the second half. Then there is some of the material would be based on this textbook by Douglas Gregory on classical mechanics, some of the discussions on Lagrangian mechanics. And finally, for feedback control part, we have one fairly popular textbook on feedback control by Franklin Powell and Imami Naini. It's called Feedback Control of Dynamic Systems. In addition to this, I may use 1 or 2 other textbooks, and I will also provide notes to the extent possible. So I have tried to make notes for every lecture, but I request you not to count on me providing notes for every lecture. I'm still making some of them, and it's just possible that I may not be able to complete a few of them. So assume by default that you have to attend these lectures or at least listen to the recordings for you to get whatever I'm teaching. Notes, please view them as a bonus. Okay, so with that, I conclude this presentation. I don't know if Professor Ghoshal has something to add to whatever I have said here. Maybe if he wishes to do so, he can.
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you, Jayant. So I will be online. I'm not teaching, but I want to also learn what Jayant is teaching. So I will be most of the time online. Yeah, if there is some particular question, if you still want to discuss with me other than Yogesh or Jayant, then you can email me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ghoshal. So it's about 11 now, 10:55. So we have another 35 minutes of time. So there's one question from Dinesh Agarwal. Dinesh, yes, kindly go ahead.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, regarding MATLAB and all, sir, we don't know actually. We never use this MATLAB. In homework and all, we are outside. We are not in the campus. How we can learn all these things, MATLAB and all.
So MATLAB, the licenses are available from IISc. So you can log in, and you can use VPN to connect to IISc servers, and from that you can download that software. And given the fact that you have told me that you are not familiar with MATLAB, we shall do it in a stage-wise manner. I mean, we'll first share with you some of some example problems that can be solved. How would you code for those problems using MATLAB? So we will make sure that you are able to do it in a stepwise manner, so that when you are taking on more difficult problems, you're already familiar with some of the common MATLAB commands, and you would be able to solve the problems. Okay, so the responsibility, however, still lies with you to become familiar with the tool. We will try to provide you with as many help files and example files and links to YouTube videos, etc., as is necessary to become familiar with MATLAB.
Okay. Sir, this MATLAB may not be needed in the exams time, no?
No. We will not give programming problems in there. That's most probably going to be the case. It's going to be pen and paper kind of an exam.
Yeah, Jayant sir, we had planned that we will organize a MATLAB session, I and Soumya, sometime.
Okay, great, Yogesh. So, thanks a lot. So
Yeah,
Yogesh has volunteered to help out. Yeah,
Very
so I think it will
helpful
be
like
very helpful. It will be very helpful. Thanks, Yogesh.
Yes, sir. Whatever this needed, at least that much, if anybody cover, then it will be very useful to all of us actually.
We'll tell you right from downloading to how we'll install that. All those things we will cover up in that.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so I just wanted to say one thing in connection with these exams and so on. So we are living through a very strange time. We are not able to meet physically, and it's not possible for us to invigilate any examination that would be conducted. So we appeal therefore to your honor code. Okay, we will from our end try our best to make sure that plagiarism is avoided. And believe me, it's easier than you think to tell if two students have copied. And there are several different ways in which you could collaborate and copy in an examination using WhatsApp, etc. But all of you are MTech students, right? I mean, I would imagine, at least in an Indian setting, that you won't have much choice when you are taking up your bachelor's education. Your parents might have forced you to get into engineering so that your your employability is improved as a consequence of that. But if you have continued further after your bachelor's and taken up master's, you have cleared a very competitive examination in the form of GATE, and IISc is a very difficult place to get into. So clearly all of you have you are fired up about engineering, mechanical engineering in particular. You're excited about it, you want to know more. So it will be very sad if such a set of students, an inspired set of students, resort to such lowly tactics as copying from one another. It will reflect very badly on what motivated you to come and take up a master's or a PhD degree in mechanical engineering or any other engineering in the first place. So I just want to appeal to all of you that please don't do that. So it's typical of Indian students to approach every subject with a certain degree of cynicism, as if those subjects matter only from the point of view of grades, and those grades matter only from the point of view of employability or future prospects or some such thing. But now that you are past that phase where you are under these influences, I request you to kindly approach learning not just this subject but every other course that you take in IISc with a slightly greater degree of idealism. Learn it for its own sake. Try to enjoy the content that is provided to you. Be interactive, ask questions, challenge me to my limits, and I would I would definitely learn a lot as a consequence of questions that you guys might ask me. Let that be the way we conduct this course together, rather than you guys viewing this as just a way to get a certain CGPA and from that a way to secure a certain job. So with that preamble, I'll start with the material that I would discuss today. I will try to share the screen again. So this is rigid body kinematics. This is material that you must have come across in your undergrad. But as I said, in this lecture and the next lecture, I shall just cover this material briefly so that you don't feel as though I'm starting to talk of new tools and techniques that you are previously completely unfamiliar with. So let me share the screen now. So are you all able to see this blank sheet of paper that I'm having here? Can one of you unmute your mics and tell me if you are able to see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I will be writing on this in today's lecture and a few other lectures from now. And then I will be using this device for writing directly on the computer called Wacom. I have not purchased that yet. So for the moment, I have this arrangement of a camera and paper for me to write on. So let us start with rigid body dynamics. Rigid body kinematics, sorry. So I shall, this is a new experience for me. So kindly bear with me while I make some adjustments so that you can view it well and I can also write it comfortably, write the material comfortably. Okay, so rigid body kinematics. So let us start with the definition of a rigid body. So what is a rigid body? So a rigid body by definition is a solid body that does not deform under the influence of mechanical loads, namely forces and moments and so on. Of course, it's an idealization. No solid object will not deform at all. So therefore there is really no solid object which perfectly fits the definition of a rigid body. But this idealization is useful, is a very good idealization and a good approximation to the behavior of solid objects under many circumstances, especially when these objects are not constrained and the forces and moments acting on the object are small. So let me first write down the definition of the rigid body. A solid body that does not deform under the influence of mechanical loads. In other words, forces and moments. So this idealization, of course, we know that a solid body does deform. In general, a solid body deforms in proportion to the applied stresses for small stresses, and then it goes through a plastic phase before it fractures. So, but in many situations, the kinds of forces that we would come across are such that such deformations do not play any role in understanding the mechanics of these objects. So for example, if you take an aircraft wing can be modeled as a rigid body. The kind of lift or the kind of drag that an aircraft experiences is just dependent on the geometry of its wing, its width and its cross section and so on. But then an aircraft wing is made of light materials, and because of some pressure fluctuations in the air, it is possible for the aircraft wing to also flutter. So there will be some vibrations in the aircraft wing as the aircraft flies in the sky. And anybody who has traveled by aircraft knows that, has seen live these vibrations. But these vibrations do not significantly affect the lift and the drag of this aircraft or the extent to which it accelerates and decelerates. So for all practical purposes, therefore, a rigid body model for an aircraft wing is an acceptable model for the wing. But if you want to analyze, for example, the stresses that would be developed in this aircraft wing, then one needs to take into account the vibration of the wing. So therefore, one as an engineer, one needs to use his or her judgment to determine under what circumstances a rigid body model is appropriate, and under what circumstances the solid body will depart significantly from the rigid body model and appropriately use the right kind of physics. So for the kind of, for mechanisms and many of the machines that we discuss, a rigid body model is a fairly good, a rigid body model is a fairly good approximation, and therefore we shall talk about it first in this course. So what I shall do to understand the motion of a rigid body is to first draw this body and slap a coordinate system to understand its motion. So here is an XY coordinate frame, and I am drawing a potato shaped object which I shall call as B. So B shall always represent a body, and a rigid body in particular. So what do we mean when we say that it does not deform in response to applied forces and moments? So if I were to take 2 points, let us say a point P and a point Q that are fixed to the rigid body, since the body is not going to be deforming under the loads, this distance between the points P and Q will remain the same at all points in time. So no matter how the body moves about in space, the distance between any 2 points fixed on the rigid body remains invariant, does not change. Okay, so if I were to represent the point P by means of its position vector P, in other words, the vector P is Px x cap plus Py y cap plus Pz z cap. Similarly, Q is Qx x cap plus Qy y cap plus Qz z cap. So Qx, Qy, Qz are the components, x, y, z components of the vector Q, as are Px, Py, and Pz the components of the vector P. So in this, I am representing the vector by means of an arrow on the top. In the notes, I am representing it just by a bold face P or a bold face Q, because this arrow is very difficult to introduce in a using in PowerPoint or Word documents. So the vector QP is nothing but the vector P minus the vector Q, and that therefore is Px minus Qx x cap plus Py minus Qy y cap plus Pz minus Qz z cap. So what is the length of this vector? It's the length of the vector that remains constant, right? It does not change no matter how the body moves. So the length of the vector is nothing but the magnitude of QP is nothing but the square root of the sum of the squares of its x, y, and z components, right? So it's Px minus Qx the square plus Py minus Qy the square plus Pz minus Qz the square, and that in a rigid body is a constant. Okay, so now that we know that if we take any 2 points on the rigid body that are fixed to the rigid body, and the distance between them has to stay a constant. Of course, this constant can be different depending on the location of these 2 points. But if I have taken 2 points, when they are moving, the distance between the 2 points remains unchanged. So how can a rigid body move while satisfying this particular constraint? So one possible motion. So I am drawing this potato once again, hopefully with the same shape as the first one, but please excuse me if there is some difference in shapes. I'm not a very good artist. So there's the point Q, there's the point P. Okay, one way in which we can conceive motion is rectilinear translation. So Q moves along a straight line and P also moves along a straight line that's parallel to the first one. So if this happens, then this vector QP does not change its orientation, and therefore the distance between the points P and Q remains the same. But a little bit of thought reveals that just straight line motion is not the only possible way in which this can happen. Translation can happen. Even if the point Q undergoes some curvilinear motion, something like this, as long as P undertakes exactly the same kind of motion, then also the vector QP remains unchanged as this rigid body moves along this curvilinear trajectory, and therefore it's possible this kind of motion is also an acceptable kind of motion for the rigid body. So either curvilinear motion or linear motion, the velocities of the points P and Q are exactly identical, and this kind of motion is called translation. Translation is, of course, a very simple solution to this problem of moving while keeping the distance between the 2 points fixed. A slightly more sophisticated solution is to move the point P alone while the point Q is fixed in such a manner that the distance between the points P and Q is a constant. And what does that translate to in terms of the trajectory for the point P? If it's planar motion, it ends up lying on a circle. If it's a three-dimensional motion, it ends up lying on a sphere. So the other kind of motion that is possible, again the same potato is drawn. Here we keep the point Q fixed and the point P is allowed to move. And since the point P and Q are points on a rigid body, the distance has to be kept the same. So one other way in which the body can move while maintaining the distance same is for the point P to rotate either one way, clockwise or counterclockwise with respect to the point Q. So this kind of motion, of course, is called rotation, pure rotation. In general, a rigid body can move, the motion of a rigid body can be a combination of both translation and rotation. So these are very simple, concepts, and they can also be visualized graphically. We know that in case of pure rotation, the velocity of this point P is proportional to the distance of the point away from the center of rotation and also proportional to the angular velocity. So while many problems can be solved, especially in two-dimensional kinematics, using graphical techniques, in 3D it becomes more and more cumbersome, and it's worthwhile to resort to mathematics to write down the expressions for velocity for both pure rotation and translation. Translation, it is fairly straightforward. The translation equation is VQ is equal to VP, where VQ and VP are by definition, the rates of change of the vectors Q and the rate of change of the vector P with respect to time. So that's pure translation. What about rotation? So to write down the mathematical expression for the velocity of the point P with respect to the velocity of the point Q, when the rigid body is executing pure rotational motion, we first start with the expression that the magnitude of the vector QP is a constant. In other words, the QP square will also be a constant. And I hope you guys know that the magnitude square of a vector is nothing but the vector taken as a dot product with itself. So QP square is QP dot producted with QP itself. I hope this is clear to you guys. If not, is there someone who wishes to raise their hands and want me to demonstrate this? If not, I shall proceed with the assumption that you guys know this. So QP dot QP is a constant, which means that if I differentiate this expression QP, I get this to be 2 times QP dot Q dot P, Q dot QP, and that will be equal to 0 because the derivative of a constant is 0. So this is the most important expression, the dot product of QP with Q dot P. Q dot of QP, sorry, not Q dot P, Q dot of QP should be equal to 0. And this permits two solutions. One is QP dot, which is the velocity of this vector QP, just write it this way, should be equal to 0. This is one possible solution. And that solution is essentially what you get when you are looking at translation. So Q dot P by definition is VQ minus VP, sorry, VP minus VQ, because QP is P minus Q. Q dot P is P dot minus Q dot, which is VP minus VQ. So VP minus VQ is equal to 0, and this is translation. And the second solution is in case of is one of rotation, where the dot product of these two vectors is 0 because one vector is orthogonal to the other vector. So let us analyze this for the case of rotation in a plane. So for the sake of simplicity, I shall bring the point Q to the origin of the coordinate system and draw the potato around that point Q. And here is this point P somewhere in the plane, and I shall designate the orientation of this vector PQ with respect to the x-axis of the coordinate system by this angle theta. So if this, we all know that the velocity of the point P, and this has been drilled into us from our 11th and 12th standard days, the velocity, the magnitude of the velocity or the speed of the point P is equal to the angular velocity, which I shall call omega z, because this whole solid is rotating in plane, or in other words, rotating about the z-axis of this coordinate system, times the magnitude of P. That's the length of this vector PQ. And since Q has been chosen to be, more generally, it should be the magnitude of QP. But since Q has been chosen to be equal to 0, has been set to be equal to 0 vector, it's just going to be magnitude of P. For the sake of simplicity, I have done this. So what is the velocity of this point? We know that the velocity will be tangential. So if the angular velocity results in a counterclockwise rotation of the point P about the origin, then the velocity of the point P will be in that direction, perpendicular to the radius vector, and would be given to be Vp will be equal to minus omega z mod P. That is the speed of that point P. Its component along the x-axis you see is negative. That's why you have this minus sign here. Sine theta x cap plus omega z mod P cos theta y cap. And we note that the term P sine theta, mod P sine theta, if this is mod P sine theta represents the y component of that vector, this particular length. Similarly, mod P sine cos theta represents the x component of that vector P. So we would therefore have Pp to be equal to minus omega z Py x cap plus omega z Px y cap. So if we are rotating about just one axis, about the z axis, our angular velocity vector omega is just omega z cap. If that is the case, then the linear velocity of the point P is given by this particular expression here. But if we have a more general case, you have omega having all three components, omega vector having omega x cap plus omega y cap plus omega z cap, then what we can do is we can separately analyze the three scenarios. Once when you have only omega z and nothing else, for which case the velocity reduces to the expression that I have written above, then you have only omega y, and now you just relabel these axes as x and z instead of x and y, and then you rewrite the expressions for Vp. And then the third, when you have only omega x, in which case you relabel the axes here as x, z and y instead of x and y, and you again rewrite Vp in that scenario. The same set of steps can be followed, just that the subscript z and x and y has to be carefully changed. Now you have the velocity due to each of these three separately taken, and by superposition, the velocity, the overall velocity of that point P will be the summation of each of these velocities. The velocities due to omega x, omega y, and omega z. And I'm writing down that expression here. The total velocity of that point P will be equal to omega y pz minus omega z py x cap plus omega z px minus omega x pz y cap plus omega x py minus omega y px z cap. So this is the expression for the velocity of a point P that is rotating about a point Q, which is assumed to be the origin in this particular coordinate system. Now, if this was not the origin, we would simply have to replace Px, Py, Pz with the terms Qpx, Qpy, and Qpz. In other words, the x component of the vector Qp, the y component of the vector Qp, and the z component of the vector Qp takes the place of Px, Py, Pz in the equation that I'm showing here, and then that gives you the angular velocity, the velocity of that point P relative to the point Q. So any questions up to this point? Okay, I don't see any hands being raised. So I hope all of you are familiar with this feature of being able to raise your hand. So I see one person, Subhadip Sahu, raising his hands. Yes, Subhadip.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good
Sir,
morning.
Can you please tell the term Vp equals to minus omega z? That point, can you please repeat once again?
QP, I didn't get you. Which one?
Sir, the second line, Vp equals to minus omega z mod of P into sine theta.
So just look at this graph. Just look at the schematic. So the velocity vector I have drawn sketched here. That's the velocity vector. If the angle theta is changing in the counterclockwise sense, do you agree with me? So omega z is nothing but theta dot z cap. Okay, is that clear to you? That the velocity has to be in that particular direction and oriented perpendicular to the radius vector QP.
Yes, sir.
Now, what is the x component of that velocity vector? If I were to decompose this velocity vector into x component and y component, you see that the x component is directed along the negative x-axis, right?
Yes, sir.
That's how I get minus omega z magnitude of P. That's how I get the minus.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll continue in that case. So we have now derived this expression. What we see is that it's a very cumbersome, very lengthy expression for the velocity that relates the velocity, linear velocity of this point P that is rotating about a certain origin, the point Q, with an angular velocity omega vector. Okay. Now, because it is so lengthy and it is so cumbersome to write, I invent a new symbol for representing this particular manipulation or multiplication, strange multiplication that we do between the angular velocity vector omega and the position vector omega x, x cap plus omega y, y cap plus omega z, z cap. We undertake a very weird kind of multiplication between omega and p, px x cap plus py y cap plus pz z cap. And that multiplication gives us this Vp. So we define this multiplication in such a way that we get this exact particular expression. And that multiplication is called as the cross product between these two vectors, right? So we define the cross product represented by into as omega cross P to be equal to this particular expression here, Vp. I don't want to write the full expression. Whatever is given on the right hand side here of this is what would come on the right hand side here. So by definition, we have a set of three numbers, omega x, omega y, and omega z. And we have a set of three other numbers, px, py, and pz. There are several different ways in which I can multiply this set of numbers with that set of numbers. Some of them can lead to scalar, some of them can lead to vectors. But we don't choose to multiply them in any arbitrary random fashion because most of these multiplications have no physical meaning. They don't make any sense. However, there are two kinds of multiplications that make physical sense. One is the dot product, which is a scalar, which is a number that we obtain by appropriately multiplying the x, y, z components of these three numbers. And then there is the cross product. The utility of the cross product is evident in this derivation. So what was a very lengthy expression can be easily abridged by using this particular symbol and packaging away the complexity through the definition of what a cross product between two vectors is. I want to dwell a little bit on this notion of a cross product because as students, we are sort of attuned to thinking of a product in terms of product of scalars. So I want to take a minute to show how different this product between vectors is compared to the product of scalars. So for one thing, if A and B are two vectors, you notice that A cross B, which is a vector product of A and B, is not the same as the vector product of B and A. So A cross B is not equal to B cross A. So this is called commutation. Okay. So A and B vectors do not commute under this cross product operation. In fact, A cross B and B cross A is instead equal to minus of A cross B. Whereas with scalar multiplication, whether I multiply 2 with 3 or 3 with 2, I get the same answer of 6. So again, this highlights the difference between. So in a way, this term product is confusing because there are big differences between the product as we have learned with scalars all along and the product as it applies to vectors. The second is what is known as associative property. So if I take 3 vectors A, B, and C and compute A cross of B cross of C, this is not equal to A cross of B cross of C. So if I were to multiply B and C first, take the cross product of between them first, and then take its cross product with A, I don't get the same answer as what I would get if I take the cross product of A and B first and then with C. The sequence in which we take the products is therefore important. This again is in stark contrast to what we see with scalars. I multiply 2, 3, and 4. Whether I multiply 2 and 3 first and then multiply with 4, or whether I multiply 3 and 4 first and then multiply with 2, I get the same answer. So again, a big difference. But there are some similarities as well. First, for example, distributive property is valid. So A cross of some 2 vectors B and C is equal to A cross of B plus A cross of C. So this is similar to distributive property. So this is commute, does not commute. Okay, so cross product operation does not commute, is not associative. And this is distributive. Okay, likewise, differentiation d by dt of A cross B can be shown to be equal to A cross dB by dt plus dA by dt cross B. You should be very careful about the sequence in which you do this cross product. It's not A cross dB by dt plus B cross dA by dt. That would be okay if A and B were scalar functions of time. But if A and B are vector functions of time, then you have to stick to the sequence carefully. And the last part, which was evident from the physical example that we took, but is nevertheless worth highlighting, is that the vector A cross B is orthogonal to both A and B. Okay, in other words, A dot of A cross B is 0, and that's also equal to B dot of A cross B. If I were to take the dot product of 2 orthogonal vectors, I get 0, right? And therefore, I end up getting 0 when I take the dot product of A or B with the cross product between the 2 vectors. So this is enough for us to describe the motion of a general rigid body in 3 dimensions. So if I have if the point P was not fixed, I would have that the point velocity of the point P is equal to the velocity of if the point Q was not fixed, I would have that the velocity of the point P is equal to the velocity of the point Q plus velocity of the point P in relation to Q. So velocity of the point P is P dot and Q is Q dot, and velocity of the point P relative to Q is QP dot. Okay, and it turns out this is a very general expression, not necessarily true only for rigid bodies, but for a rigid body, the velocity of the point P relative to Q can only be of this kind. It's of the kind omega cross QP. Okay, so Vp is equal to Vq plus omega cross QP. Okay, so with this expression, we are about done as far as determining the velocity of a rigid body is concerned. As the point P changes or the vector omega changes, the velocity of the point P will change in relation to Q. So Vp is equal to Vq captures the translational motion, and Vp is equal to omega cross Qp captures the rotational motion, the 2 kinds of motion that are possible for a rigid body. So we shall conclude this with a simple example. I know it is time, it is 11:30. I'll just not solve the problem completely, but for the sake of illustration, take it up and then complete the class. So let us take a 4-bar mechanism. Again, these are stuff that you must have come across in your undergrad. So I'm not going to delve too deeply into them. So this is the point Q, this is the point P. I call this angle theta 2, I call that angle theta 1. and the input, the crank has a length of 0.1 meter, 10 centimeters, and is rotating at a rate of 10 radians per second. The coupler has a length of 0.2 meters. I call this link 2 and I call that link 1, and this link 3. This has 0.3 meter length, and the angle at this instant, at the instant we are viewing, the angle here is theta1. The angle that the crank makes with the horizontal, and the angle that the other link 3 makes with the horizontal is theta2. And you are asked to determine the angular velocities of the second link and the third link. How do we do it? You know the angular velocity of the first link. So we just have to apply these, the rigid, we have 3 rigid links, right? So we have to apply the expressions for velocity carefully. Since the point Q lies on the rigid link 1, we know that the velocity of Q has to be perpendicular to this particular radius vector. So I can do this graphically. If this radius vector is like this, I draw a line perpendicular to that at 90 degrees to it, and this vector represents the velocity of the point Q. Now, in this schematic, the line PQ is shown to be horizontal. So the velocity of the point P will be equal to velocity of the point Q plus omega cross, I'll call this omega 2 cross QP, and omega 2 cross QP has to be perpendicular to both omega 2 and QP. Omega 2 is of course out of the plane of the paper because it's a planar mechanism. QP, however, is horizontal. So therefore, the term omega cross QP, we don't know its value. We know QP, but we don't know omega 2. We know its direction, however. It has to be perpendicular to QP, and therefore it has to be along this vertical line. Okay. So this expression Vp is equal to Vq plus this one indicates that if Vq is like this and omega 2 cross QP is some other line like this, the two vectors should add up to give me Vp. This is how that vector diagram should look like. Now this exact geometric analysis reveals that omega 2 cross QP should be along a vertical line. Okay. Similarly, the point P is also independently a point on the third rigid body, and therefore, the third rigid body rotates about this other hinge here, and therefore the velocity of that point P should be perpendicular to this radius vector as well. So I shall roughly draw that as well. I don't know if I shall draw a straight line which is perpendicular to the let me call this OPQR. This is perpendicular to OP. So this dotted line is the line along which the point P has to lie, because it's also part of the third rigid body. So the point P has to lie on, the velocity of the point P has to lie on this vertical line because it's part of the second rigid body and has to obey this equation. And it also has to lie on the third rigid body because it also has to obey this equation, OP, this equation. And that gets it to lie on that particular thing. So as a consequence, the intersection of the two lines is where it will lie. So this will be the velocity Vp, and this will be the velocity of V of P relative to Q. In other words, this will be omega 2 cross QP. Okay. So we know from geometry, we know that this angle has to be theta1, that angle has to be theta2, and therefore we get the expressions for Vp and Vq by looking at this triangle. We know Vp, we know Vq, and that's equal to 1 meter per second. The magnitude is known, the orientation is known. We can use that to solve for everything else. I'll just write down the expressions here. Magnitude of Vp is equal to magnitude of Vq times sine of theta1 divided by sine theta2. Magnitude of V of P relative to Q, which is basically magnitude of omega 2 cross QP, is equal to, I have not written it here, magnitude of Vp cos theta2 plus magnitude of Vp sin theta2. Sorry, cos theta1. Okay, so we have the the magnitude and of Vp as well as the relative velocity of P with respect to Q, and we can use that to derive the angular velocities of the second and the third links. The angular velocity of the second link, omega 2, will be magnitude of that will be equal to the magnitude of V of P relative to Q divided by the magnitude of PQ, which is this expression basically divided by the magnitude of PQ is 0.2 meters. Okay. Similarly, omega 3 will be equal to magnitude of VP divided by magnitude of, and that's again, we know the magnitude, the expression for VP divided by OP is 0.3 meters. So this solves the problem. So we can also do this by looking at the X and Y components, by balancing the X and Y components of the vector VP as obtained from from this expression, from the expression of velocity as applied to the link 3 and as applied to link 2. We can equate the two and then also solve this problem, and we would get the same answer. So we shall stop at this point. Are there any further questions? Abhishek Kar has a question. Yes.
Yeah, yes, sir.
So we are done.
Sorry.
Others, if you have another class to attend now, you can log off. We are done with this class. Thanks a lot for joining us here.
Okay, sir. So actually, I wanted to ask this question earlier, but opportunity.
Okay.
When you mentioned the PX, PY, PZ, up to that part I understood, as well as the QP portion. However, when you say QPX, QPY, QPZ, that is the velocity components with respect, like the axis of rotation is still at Q, right?
Yes, axis of rotation is still along the Z axis. This QPX, QPY, QPZ represents the X, Y, and Z components of the vector QP.
No, I mean like when it was being made simply PX, PY, PZ, that was when Q was at the origin.
Correct.
So when you consider QPX, QPY, QPZ, you're no longer placing Q at the origin, right?
Exactly. Right.
So doesn't make so the axis of rotation.
What is the rotation about? The rotation is still about the point Q.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. No, that was my basic doubt.
Rotation is still about the point Q.
Right. Okay. Then that's fine. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thanks. Any other questions? So if there are no other questions, we will stop this class today. So thanks for joining me. We'll meet again on Thursday at 10 a.m. Bye.
Thank you, sir.